Well, good morning. I am glad that you're joining us this morning, and I want you to please, if you're not in the habit of doing this when you watch online, please take a moment just to check in, put a comment or something, just so we'll know that you're out there. And I understand this is really, really different this morning. We were kind of at a loss on how exactly to do this. We didn't want to just do a regular looking service and pretend that there's everybody out there. So we're kind of trying some different things, experimenting a little bit. So I hope that you'll understand that as we go along. I don't know for sure because my kids are older, but especially those of you with younger kids, I can imagine that this is some really trying times. I've been really encouraged to see, especially the teachers who are putting stuff out on Facebook and online for the students, and I just think that's awesome. I've said this before, but I really mean this, that Owosso public school teachers are the absolute best. I really believe that. If you believe that, go ahead and comment on there if you would say amen to that. But I know that it's hard. I don't know if you saw this or not. I don't even remember whose page it was on, but I saw something on Facebook that kind of summed it up. And it was written on a little index card by a little guy named Ben. And on March 16th, Ben wrote this. He said, "Ben, homed school, it's not going good," he writes. "My mom's getting stressed out. My mom's getting really confused. So we took a break so my mom can figure this stuff out. And I'm telling you, it is not going good." I don't know how many of you can resonate with that. I think that kind of describes all of us. We're all just a little stressed out. I think we're all a bit confused. We're just trying to figure this stuff out. And I think we'd all have to agree that so far, it's just not going well. So today I want to kind of talk on the second part of Be Anxious for Nothing. I want us to talk about how we can be guarded, how our minds can be guarded by peace. And so in Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 9, if you have a Bible with you, open up a Bible. If you are accustomed to reading a Bible on Kindle, as many people are, I want you to understand that this passage from Philippians, especially Philippians 4, 6, and 7, are the most highlighted verses by readers who use the Kindle to read the Bible. And so it's an amazing thing. In fact, I also read that it's actually one of the most highlighted passages of any Bible passages, whether it's a paper Bible or an electronic Bible. YouVersion version says the same thing. But these verses are so meaningful because they're written by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is in Rome. He's in prison for doing nothing other than preaching the good news of Jesus. And he writes these words to the Christians in Philippi and to you and I because we're kind of stressed. We're a little bit confused. And we're just trying to figure this thing out. So Paul writes these words to them in Philippians 4. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all, because the Lord is near. And don't be anxious about anything," he said, "but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And then he ends this passage by saying, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy," he says, "think on these things. Whatever you have learned or heard or received from me or seen in me, put it into practice." And he says, "The God of peace will be with you." There's a reason why that is the most popular highlighted verse in Scripture. Because fear and anxiety is a problem of our times. It's a problem of our society, even before the current situation we find ourselves in. And what we are experiencing now, I think, is pretty unique. I mean, one of the worst economic situations that we've probably ever had in our lifetimes, most of us, combined with this health scare. Not to mention the shortage of toilet paper, which is very distressing in and of itself. And we don't know how to deal with this anxiety that we may be feeling. And so this passage from Philippians, I think there's a reason why it's one of the most highlighted verses in the Bible. However, it is interesting to me, and I've said this before, maybe you remember it, that the most highlighted passage on Kindles, people that read books on Kindle, the most highlighted passage of any book, as of a couple years ago, I think it's still the same, but it comes from the second novel of the Hunger Games series, and it's this sentence: Because sometimes things happen to people and they're not equipped to deal with it. The most highlighted passage of any book, because sometimes things happen to people and they're not equipped to deal with it. And so I think that also is a good description of how we're feeling. And so what I want to do today, and what the Apostle Paul wanted to do, is to try to equip us to handle these feelings and to deal with them. And so Paul in Philippians 4, he talks about how do we find this kind of peace in the midst of anxiety. And I want to talk just for a few minutes about that. And so he says that if we do this, we'll get a peace which passes understanding. A peace which passes understanding. It's kind of hard. It's hard for me as a communicator, but because I want to try to communicate to you, how do you get this peace? And yet Paul says you really can't understand it. So how is it that I can explain it to you? And so it's kind of difficult to understand, and yet many of you know exactly what he's talking about. Many of you have felt that peace that just comes over you at a time when it's least expected, the least warranted. In fact, your situation might be exactly the opposite of peace, and yet those of you who are believers know that in those instances, many times this peace just washes over you. And some of you would testify to this, that you find yourself in a storm. And if somebody were to describe to you the storm that you're in the middle of now, you would have said before it happened that I don't know how I would do. Like, I don't know if I would survive that. And yet here you are, and you find yourself in the middle of whatever it might be, and yet you find this amazing peace. And so we want to talk about that this morning. Now, there's a lot of things that cause anxiety. Just name a couple of them. We get anxiety because what we call the unknown. We just don't know. And we ask ourselves the question all the time, what if? What if? So much of our anxiety kind of revolves around this what if question. What if there's another terrorist attack? What if the economy doesn't rebound? What if I never find someone to spend my life with? What if our marriage doesn't make it? What if I can't get a job? What if my kids don't make a successful transition to adulthood? And the list just goes on and on and on. What if? What if? And it causes us anxiety, and it's not even happened yet. And in all likelihood, it may not happen. Anxiety also comes because of that from the unlikely things. The unlikely things that are probably never going to happen, and yet they kind of consume our thoughts. And you know as well as I do that especially now, we live in a world, for better or for worse, we've got this 24-hour news cycle coming at us from multiple different mediums, and we're constantly aware of what's going on around the world, and we've got this danger of smartphones, and we're on them all the time, and we listen to too much news, and let me tell you, that's me. I'll confess, I have spent way too much time listening, reading news of various kinds, different sources, and granted, in times of emergency like this, it is important to keep informed. But if we're not careful, we'll watch too much, we'll listen to too much, we'll read too much, and there's a lot of stuff out there. And I don't care who you are or what political aisle you go down. I don't care who you are. You'll have to admit that a lot of what we're hearing from all the sources is sometimes misleading, often conflicting, often confusing. And it can really just heighten our sense of anxiety. And then there's Facebook. I have a love-hate relationship with Facebook. I love it in the fact that you're watching me right now. But also it's got some really serious problems. Facebook, as you might know, has been in trouble recently because they have not been self-policing, what they call it. They've not been self-policing themselves, and so they're allowing far too much clickbait, they call it, just garbage on there. And I started looking at, I was reading the news the other day, and there was an article about some of the fake news headlines from Facebook from the last couple years. These are stories that people clicked on millions of times. People read these things and thought they were real news stories. So one of them that kind of caught my attention because we used to live there was this. It said, Charles Manson to be released on parole in Johnson City, Tennessee. Like, we used to live there. But you may just read that and you may think, oh, that's interesting. You know, Charles Manson's going to get paroled in Johnson City, Tennessee, and unless you live in Johnson City, Tennessee. And then you start to get really anxious about it. And you probably go outside and like everybody else, everybody starts to look like him. Like that guy over there. Yeah, he's a little Charles Manson looking to me, and people just freak out. You start feeling this anxiety over something that is just so not true. Another fake news story. This one also hit a little close to home. Said weapon-toting clowns go on murderous rampage. Maybe you remember hearing about some of these stories, and people were anxious about clowns for a while. And I heard these stories and I read these stories, and you know me, I was like, finally somebody else sees the danger of clowns. Like I do not like clowns. I don't like clowns, and finally somebody is going to outlaw clowns. And then there was this follow-up fake news story to this one. Congress passes law authorizing citizens to legally shoot and kill suspicious clowns. Like, I don't have a gun, but I thought about going out and getting one because I do not like clowns. And this, even though I knew it was not right, I was a little more anxious over clowns than I usually am. There's another category that I would throw out there that makes us anxious, and that is just the uncontrollable things of life. There's so much in life we can't control. There's an expert in the field of anxiety and field of handling stress named Dr. Edward Hallowell. And he came up with this kind of equation for anxiety. He says, anxiety takes place when there is a heightened sense of vulnerability and a diminished sense of power. A heightened sense of vulnerability and yet a diminished sense of power to do anything about it. And so when we find ourselves in places where we feel vulnerable, but we don't have any power to control anything or do anything about it, that can create more and more anxiety. And so for me, I read that, and like my mind goes to a lot of things that would fit in that category, but maybe some of you can understand this and you've dealt with it yourself. I would put like teaching your kids to drive in that category. That is kind of what I think of. To me, that is a definition of heightened sense of vulnerability without any power to control it. And I'm not saying that because my kids were horrible drivers. They were just kind of normal drivers. But if you've been through it, it is absolutely terrifying. Ron Wilson is sitting out here listening to this. He used to teach driver's training. Like, I don't know how he did that. Like, he's got to have nerves of steel. But it is a terrifying thing to be in a car with somebody who is learning to drive and you cannot really control it. Like, there's no brake on the dashboard. We think there is because we push it, but there's no brake. And in almost every situation when our kids were learning to drive, at one point or another, the driving instructor came to me. A couple times they kept my kids after class because they wanted to have a word with me. And they said, listen, you need to be driving more with your kid. Like you just need, every time you get in the car to go somewhere, whether it's a family or by yourself, they need to be driving. You need to let them drive more. And like my response kind of in my mind was always the same. Well, it's easy for you to say because you have a brake on your side of the car. You let me use your car with the brake and maybe I won't be as terrified about doing it. But we do not like things when we don't have control. It makes us anxious. And I think for a lot of us that describes how we feel. I mean, like we're hopefully doing our best to do what they tell us to do. We're social isolating, we're doing all these things, but really, we don't really have any control over how fast this thing goes away or controlling the virus or the economic situation. And it kind of describes the situation that we're in as we look to the future, that we're kind of in a car with somebody else driving it, and there's really nothing we can do, and it makes us anxious. So Paul says in Philippians 4, He says the first thing is to pray about everything. Verse 6, he says, pray in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And so he gives us specifically two kinds of prayers here. He talks about thanksgiving, and then he talks about prayers of petition or supplication or things that we ask God for. And so the reason that's important is because for many of us, we have tried to cast our anxiety on God, and we've found ourselves in this position where we're praying about our anxiety. And so we make a list, like, God, here's all the things that I'm anxious about, and somewhere in the middle of the prayer, we kind of realize that I'm more anxious now than I was when I started this prayer. It's because prayer is not just about telling God about your anxiety, but there is a certain way to pray here. He says it's a praying with thanksgiving and gratitude. And one of the things anxiety does is it blinds us to the good things. It blinds us to God's blessings. It keeps us from having a perspective of gratitude. And listen, it puts a very disproportionate amount of emphasis on things in our life that we wish were different. And so it blinds us from blessings. Now, last week I mentioned how in our country and in our time, and even now, we are so addicted to comfort and convenience and abundance. We're so used to stores fully stocked, full medical care whenever we need it, and a lot of times even when we don't need it, that even today, most people in the world would go into our stores and see the things that we have, and they would say, what are you so worried about? What are you stressed out about? And we just have to get it through our heads that the way we have lived, the way we currently live, and the way we will probably live again, I'll going to address that a little bit more next week, but it is something that's unknown and unheard of to the most of the world for most of human history. And yet, we don't understand it, we don't realize it, we don't thank God enough for it. So Paul says, hey, when you pray, first of all, pray with thanksgiving. This is where you're paying attention to the blessings and being thankful for what you have. And then, yes, Paul does talk about prayers of petition and prayers of asking God for help. And this is where we ask God to intervene. And like I hope that you're doing that on a daily basis. We need to be praying for our country, for our president, for our leaders, for all these people trying to figure this stuff out. Paul says, pray, prayers of petition. But it's not just about everything. It's not just about how we pray that relieves anxiety. But one of the prayers we ought to pray to God is, God, what do you want me to do about this? What do you want me to do about this? Because you see, at some point, what we have to do in our prayers is we've got to stop talking to God about our anxiety and begin talking to our anxiety about God. We've got to stop talking to God about our anxieties and tell our anxieties something about this God that we serve, about how mighty He is, how awesome He is, how He has promised to provide for us. And then sometimes we need to seriously ask God, what do you want me to do about this thing I'm anxious about? God, would you just kind of tell me, what do I need to do about this? Because a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, here's what I know. A lot of times when we are anxious, and if it's something that keeps kind of coming up, it's maybe kind of like a light on a dashboard in our life telling us that there's something that we need to address. There is an area that needs some attention. And you say, God, what do you want me to do about this thing? I may not be able to control everything. Ultimately, maybe I can't control this. But God, is there something that you want me to do? Say, well, I've been casting my financial anxiety on you, God, for example, but what do I need to do? What do I need to do? We just had the last class last Monday in the Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University class, and I'm going to tell you what, if you have ever felt anxious about money, you need to take that class, because one of the things that he talks about is that he breaks it down into baby steps. And the very first baby step is that we need to do whatever we can, sell whatever, do whatever you got to do to get $1,000 cash in the bank. That $1,000 cash is like an emergency fund that will hopefully keep you from having to go into further debt. Baby step 2 then is to get rid of all your debt. But baby step 3 is then to accumulate 4 to 6 months worth of expenses in cash, so that if something were to happen, you wouldn't be as anxious. Now, I can't imagine what would happen, right? Because we live in America and things like this never happen. But we started taking this class, weeks ago, and I read that part and we listened to him talk about it. And I'm like, man, that is right. How much anxiety would that relieve if we just had, if we had a few months worth of expenses that we could tap into? So maybe God would challenge you as you're anxious maybe about finances. And granted, a lot of it's not our fault. Most of it's not our fault. Probably not a lot you can do about it. But have you put together a budget? Have you paid careful attention to how you're spending? Have you made some certain changes in your life? And so this idea that we want to pray about these things, but sometimes the prayer is, God, what do I need to do? And so Paul says, hey, pray about everything. Then he assures them in verse 19 that God will meet all of your needs according to your glorious riches. Again, that doesn't mean that we just sit around and wait for manna coming from the sky. We need to probably do something. We need to use the brains God gave us, but ultimately we need to trust that God has promised us that he will supply all of our needs. That he'll take care of what needs to be taken care of. And so we learn to turn to him and trust in him first and foremost. I want to be careful here because I know that there are some people who in dealing with anxiety, like maybe you need some professional help even before all this stuff started. So we have things like counselors and therapy, and sometimes there are medicinal things and prescriptions that can help, and those things can be good and can be helpful, and you know that because I've said that many times in my own life. Both of those have been helpful to me, and so I'm not wanting to pit one against the other, but what I'm saying is that where are we going first? First and foremost, that we need to be turning to God, that we look to God for our peace and our comfort. He's not a last resort. Like if nothing else works, then maybe I'll try this God thing. I'll go to church. I'll do whatever. But let me try these other things first. Paul says, you turn to God first about everything. And then he challenges us in verse 8. He says, just think about good things. And this is so crucial again right now. Maybe the most important thing in this passage, when he says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy, he says, think about these things. He says, look, if you're struggling with anxiety, if you're having a hard time finding peace, then you got to be really careful. You've got to filter your thoughts through this list and ask yourself, does this describe what I'm thinking about? Do I think about things that are lovely and pure and praiseworthy and excellent? Are these the things that I'm thinking? Anybody that's taken Psychology 101 will learn about this thing called cognitive psychology, that to a large degree, how we think about things and what we think about things determines almost everything else in our lives. And we hear that, and sometimes we dismiss it because, well, that's just self-help movement and humanism and all this other stuff. But the Bible would back that up. The Bible puts a huge emphasis in many places on how we think about things and what we think about. And it goes to great lengths to talk about how what we think matters. And a few months ago, we did a series called Flip the Script, and we talked about how Satan wants to hand us kind of a script every day about our lives, about what we think, about what's going on and what's happening, and sometimes we accept that from our enemy, and it kind of becomes part of us. And so what we need to do is we need to flip the script, and that's really what Paul is saying. Hey, instead of doom and gloom and anxiety and paranoia, we need to think about things that are pure and lovely, not be a Pollyanna but to just spend more time thinking about good things than we do about bad things. And there are so many beautiful and noble things that are going on right now. And in so many ways, so many people are responding in such beautiful ways to what's going on. On my Facebook page, I'm trying to post stuff which is just beautiful and stuff that makes me smile, because I figure if it makes me smile, it'll make everybody smile. But one of the things I posted on my page was this little 6-year-old girl in Hawaii, and she's got this classical guitar, and she's singing I Wish You Love. And I just watched that, and literally tears started coming to my eyes. But then I started thinking about bad things, and I got annoyed because she plays so much better than I do, and I felt really bad about that. But it's such an amazing thing. Or then I saw this video of, maybe you remember this, when after the Grammys one year, all the biggest pop stars of the 80s all got together. They were tired. They instead of going out to Grammy parties, they all got together and they recorded "We Are the World." And I don't even know where I saw it or who put it on there, but man, just what a beautiful moment in time. Things that are noble, things that are true, things that are right. Like, don't think about bad things. I was reading an article by a movie guy, movie critic or whatever, and he very helpfully had, here's a list of good movies you can watch while you're kind of sequestered. Here's the things that you should watch. Here's some great movies for such a time as this. Movies like Outbreak, movies like Pandemic, And he had this whole list of disaster movies that he recommends that we watch right now. And evidently he doesn't know that we're kind of living through one of those right now. But why would you want to watch stuff like that? What we tell ourselves, what we think about has a big impact. And so Paul says, hey, spend a lot of time thinking about things that are lovely and noble. And then lastly, in verse 9, Paul tells us to live for God in all things. And he connects the peace of God to living God's way. And so he says, hey, whatever you have learned or heard or received from me, or whatever you saw in me when I was with you, he says, put these things into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. And so he connects the peace of God to the way that we live. That you put these things that we're talking about into practice. You live according to God's way, and you'll experience a deeper level of God's peace. That there is a connection here. Like I hate to put it this way, but the Bible doesn't talk about, hey, just kind of live however you want to live, and then when you go through rough times, expect there to be this tremendous peace from God. That's most often not how it works. God says there's a connection between what we believe and what we experience. God says, you put others first. You put others first, and you'll experience peace. God says, don't covet. So we put that into practice. I don't want to live with the anxiety and jealousy of comparisons. God says, sex is reserved for marriage. And so I'm going to live that out of my life. I don't live with the anxiety of emotional insecurity, that there's a deeper peace coming from committed, connected, deeper intimacy and relationships with my spouse. God says to be generous. So I'm going to put that into practice, and I'm going to learn to be content. I'm not going to be anxious over how much I have or how much I don't have. And by giving away money, we take its power away over us. Going back to the Dave Ramsey class, I don't know if I mentioned or not earlier, but everybody needs to take Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University, all right? But the very last session is one that we watched last Monday, and he talks about outrageous generosity. And it was actually the best talk on giving and generosity I've ever seen or heard in my life. But he talks about basically everything that we've talked about in the class up until that point is really all just to get to step 7, and that's outrageous generosity. Like that is what we're put here for. And I love the way he put it. He said, you can do everything that we've talked about in this class. You can get out of debt. You can put away savings. You can do all these things that we talked about. And you will have, he said, you will have more than likely financial security. You'll be in a better place financially, he said. He said, you can do everything that we've talked about and you can be financially secure. He said, but if you don't practice outrageous generosity, you're not going to have peace. You can have financial security, but you're not going to have financial peace. And you see, what he's talking about there is really the only way to break the anxiety-provoking power of money over us is to be generous with it, is to experience the provision and the blessing of God, is to trust God and say, God, I know that if I give this away, if I'm generous, I know that you will provide, that you will bless me, God. And that is an amazing amount of peace and comfort, knowing that God really can be trusted. A lot of things God says, we need to align our life with it. Practice self-discipline. God says to regularly meet with his people. And so we put that into practice when we gather for church when we're able to. And as much as I think it's awesome that we are one church in many locations today, I really long for the day when we're here back together, because there is strength when we're together. But for now, technology is an amazingly wonderful thing that can help us stay connected. It's amazing. It's awesome what all of this technology does. In fact, I heard a preacher not too long ago who did this sermon series on basically how bad technology was, and he warned his church how horrible and bad it was, and he did that for 3 weeks. I can't remember his name, but maybe he was wrong a little bit. I don't know. God says to forgive, so I'm going to put that into practice. I'm not going to live with bitterness. I'm not going to live with anxiety that comes from trying to get even with somebody. God says to worship him. And so I'm going to put that into practice. And I'm going to have the anxiety melt away as I remember who God is, as I remember what God has said, and as I remember that God is still on his throne no matter what's going on down here. I was really intrigued by something I read from the American Heart Association. They were talking about how to live with reduced stress. Here's one of the suggestions they made. Said, examine your values and live by them. The more your actions reflect your beliefs, the better you'll feel. Examine your values and live by them. The more your actions reflect your beliefs, the better you'll feel. It's almost like that's kind of what Paul said, isn't it? That's exactly what Paul was saying. And I think for some of us, this is really significant because I'll be honest with you, and we all have our moments like this where we say, I believe in God. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. And yet we haven't fully aligned our life around that belief. And it's created this anxiety. It's created this internal dissonance or this disharmony between what we say that we believe and how we're actually living our life. And if you're watching this morning, and I just want you to know that I love you, but if you are not plugged into a worshiping community, if you have not fully gone full in on being a Christian, like you're just kind of dancing around the edges of it. You like some of the things in the Bible because they help us cope and they help us get through stuff, but you haven't yet fully said, I'm all in on being a Christian. You need to do that. Because until you do that, you might have times where you experience some peace, but more so you're going to just experience this dissonance, this disharmony between what you're trying to believe and sometimes what you say you believe, and yet your actions. And so one of the things that I think we need to be challenged with this week, this month, going forward, is that we need to take a look at what do I believe? What do I believe? And what about my belief systems needs to be addressed? And then once I address that, how do I align my life on a daily basis with what I say that I believe, with what my priorities are? Is all this lining up with what God's word says? Now, next week, I'm going to be kind of continuing in this vein. I'm going to be talking about the God who suffers with us. The God who suffers with us. And I'm going to talk about what do we really believe about God in times of suffering and turmoil and grief and uncertainty. And then I'm going to talk about how does Christianity best equip us to handle suffering compared to every other belief system. That sounds really heavy and deep. It's not going to be that heavy and deep, but I do want you to understand that it will answer a lot of questions for you. Because as a church, I would love nothing more than for us as a community to be known as a community of peace and joy in the midst of sometimes difficult and overwhelming challenges and circumstances. It doesn't come because we just try to drum up good feelings. It comes from God. It comes from a peace, says Paul, that passes understanding. And I believe God wants you. God wants every one of us to experience that peace today and this week and in the coming months, no matter what happens. As we remember that God is the one. God is the one who is in the driver's seat. And so we just need to do what we can, but ultimately we need to release control and trust in the driver to get us where he wants us to go.